make a start. We may get some more people popping in as we go. My name's Dr. Laura McGrath. I'm one of the conveners of the Gender Critical Research Network. I'm very excited about the talk today. We've got Dr. Laura Favaro with us. Before I hand over to Laura, something about the network. So we are a network created for open and respectful debate on issues of gender and sex. So please be aware, mindful that these are sensitive topics, and we ask that everybody maintains a respectful tone throughout all of our interactions today. Anybody who's not doesn't do that, we will reserve the right to eject people from the seminar. Hopefully we won't have to do that, obviously. Please be aware these are things where people have strong views and also quite different views, and those are all fine in this space. So with that said, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Laura Favaro. Laura is a postdoctoral fellow at City University in London, where she's been researching the gender wars in academia for 3 years. So she's a sociologist interested in feminism, education, cultural studies, and social research methods, having researched and taught in these areas at universities both in England and Spain. Prior to obtaining her PhD in 2017, she worked in compulsory education. And Laura's going to be talking to us today about her research looking at the gender wars in academia. So over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to the whole team for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. And of course, thank you to all of you who have joined us today for what is actually my very first presentation on my sociological inquiry into the disputes around conflicts, debates around sex and gender that have escalated since the mid 2010s. And I've been focusing in particular on feminism and academia in the context of England. And sorry, just a minute. The research has, oh, can you see my screen? Okay. Can you see my screen?
It's just gone blank, and now it's gone off again. So maybe try again.
Right.
Worked perfectly before, didn't it?
Oh, it was perfect. Okay.
So try again. There we go. Yes, we can see it now.
So let me just go to the one before. Oh, why isn't it allowing?
There you go.
There. Okay.
There.
So as I was saying, the research took the form of an ethnography with data collection activities, including an extensive and comprehensive review of relevant documents, social media analysis, primarily via an 18-month-long observation of public Twitter. In turn, that material informed the formal semi-structured interviews that I'm going to be talking about today. And then all of these qualitative data then informed the development of a survey questionnaire with Vanessa Gash, which we fielded in the summer, having invited representative samples of social scientists, both in England and in Ireland. And of course, throughout the 3 years, I have been writing field notes and keeping a research diary. And this captures my everyday experiences at work. The very many and ongoing informal conversations, my experiences post-publications, etc. I also used a case study approach to one particular incident, which is the 2019 Feminist Dilemmas, Feminist Hope event that took place at City. It was actually the launch of the Gender and Sexualities Research Centre, where I am based. And it was also to celebrate 30 years of the now Feminist Studies Association. And what happened was that during Q&A, Julia Long, who was a member of the audience, she asked, and I'm here quoting Jeffries as she puts it in her book, she asked why the conference was not covering the war on women being waged by men who pretend to be women. There was an aggressive reaction against Long from a male member of the panel who identifies as a woman, and but because Long's question was perceived as hate-filled transphobic speech and in solidarity with the transgender community, the majority of the audience left the lecture theatre in protest, whilst security was brought in to remove Long. And alongside her companion, Sheila Jeffries, they left the building walking past the crowd of academics, booing, cheering, shouting, and chanting "shame, shame." And I've collected a range of data, and that includes the testimonies of 10 people who were there. I wasn't there that day. But more generally, the interview study aimed to explore a broad range of different perspectives and experiences by academics who self-define as feminists and research and/or teach around topics related to gender. And to assist recruitment, I created 3 participant categories. So the first 2 were individuals whose views were publicly available as supportive of what at the time I was heuristically calling gender affirmative and gender critical views. And then I had a 3rd category for those that, to my knowledge, had never publicly expressed views with respect to the dispute. Among many other things, during recruitment, I was looking for internal range in terms of approach to feminism, but also with regards to academic discipline, because I wanted to discuss the different issues involved in the dispute with experts in the corresponding areas. So altogether, I invited 112 individuals to take part. And I conducted 50 interviews. These different numbers have to do with the moment when, taking into consideration, my resources and the time that I had, I felt like I had reached sufficient understanding. And so this is what I'm going to be talking about today, primarily, these 50 interviews. But they average in length 1 hour and 20 minutes, so it's a lot of material. And as I was saying before, this is my first talk, and so admittedly I'm very eager to share findings, and I'm aware that the presentation is a bit too long, so I might go a bit too fast. If I do, please stop me or take note of anything that you'd like us to go back to, any quotes, any slides, and we can do that during discussion. A little bit more about the achieved interview sample. So at the time of the interview, participants were based at 27 different universities across England, with the exception of 6 who were either retired or no longer in academia, but still very active with regards to the gender wars. Along with other 5 participants who I considered to be key informants, and they were based at other English-speaking countries. I spoke with scholars working across a diversity of social sciences mainly, but also humanities, with sociology in particular being particularly represented. I also spoke to editors and/or editorial board members at 14 feminist, gender and/or sexuality studies academic journals, as well as those with key roles at 7 relevant academic groups. And participants also had other types of, internal and external roles within academia, for instance, with regards to EDI, but also beyond academia. I spoke, as you can see, primarily to those in the mid and late stages of their career. And here you can also see the way that I have categorized the different posts in terms of early, mid, and late. In the consent form, I offered participants 3 main modalities of participation as regards to, whether they wanted to be audio recorded, not attributed in outputs, not. But they also had the opportunity to amend the consent form as they wished. And in here, what I wanted to point out is the contrast between those categorized under GA and those under GC, the way that those in the GA category primarily opted for being anonymous, whilst a relative, a large number of those in the GC category wanted to participate on the record. And I see this as related to the no debate approach that I'm going to be talking about. But first, the note of on terminologies. So those in the GA group defined their perspective variously as trans-inclusive, intersectional, queer, or transfeminism. Those in the GC group spoke about radical feminism, second wave, materialist, socialist feminism. And whilst there were differences internally, I still identified a patterned shared key tenets and aims. And when it comes to comparatively the two groups, there's a very sharp contrast. And here are some examples in that table. And so on the basis of the analysis of the whole qualitative data, I find it more useful to think about the 2 main orientations in the dispute as I have studied it. I'm not saying that there's no other orientations, but in my data, I find it useful to talk about feminism versus genderism. And so let me talk a little bit then about genderism. I identified 2 main definitions of sex as an oppressive social construct and as a biological reality on a spectrum that can at least in part change. And even in the interviews, the same participant would draw upon both definitions. When it comes to gender, I identified 2 main models. The performative model, very much influenced by Butler, where gender is seen as indistinguishable from sex, with both being socially or discursively constructed. And then the more recent biopsychosocial model, and here Barker is a key author, where gender is seen as a combination of biological, psychological, and social worlds that are impossible to tease apart. Hence the preference for the combined concepts of sex, gender, and more recently gender sex. And here gender is seen as always unique and personal. And as was the case with the concept of sex, in the interviews, participants would often drew on both models when they were, defining concepts, as is here the case. In the interviews, there was little support intellectually for the psychobiologist model, but there was support politically. So, this model of the brain-body incongruence. And so, for instance, in this interview with a journal editor, at first she said, she defined she was talking about the journal, and she said, we won't really publish anything that defines gender in an essential way. But then she said, we definitely publish a lot of trans theory, and that would be included. And then she explained that in terms of, that she saw that as political strategies. And she said, the only way trans people are going to get rights is if they prove they have no choice. So that was on that basis they would include that position. So despite the ambiguity, the difference in definitions around sex and gender, genderism as a general orientation or movement does cohere around the core concept of gender identity. And as the audience will know, it's defined as each person's internal sense of being male, female, a combination of the two or neither. And here there's also the belief that we all have a gender identity and that it's a core part of who we are. Then in terms of the political subject, it refers to all those who feel subjected to gender oppression. And this is defined in a very different way to feminism. This is defined as lack of individual choice and as lack of external affirmation relating to one's gender identity. So this is a gender liberationist movement. Gender is seen as a source of pleasure, of creativity, of diversity, of sense of self. And so there's very much a rejection of the feminist, call for the abolition of gender, and which can even be seen, in sectors of trans activism as a dog whistle for the genocide of trans people. And also, hence, all the critical references that we see regarding anti-genderism, anti-gender movements, because this is a pro-gender movement. Gender is not seen as the problem, but rather cisgenderism, compulsory heterosexuality, binary thinking, consistent with queer theory, the naming of and assigning of categories to others, which is seen as the ultimate exercise of power. And here, of course, we're talking specifically about sex categories, and hence the calls for a linguistic move away from sex towards gender across contexts. So again, what does genderism cohere around? These core aims for gender identity to replace sex, for an affirmation of gender identity without exception, and that includes unlimited, what is called bodily autonomy, self-ID in law, etc. And then there's also a pattern set of tactics, which includes the no debate tactic that I'm going to be talking about in a minute. But I also wanted to quickly point out that in some sectors, we also see very extreme manifestations of violence against women or threats of violence against feminists, both online and offline. And that's in activism, but this has entered our other domains, including academia. And we can also find, in the name of feminism, very open calls by high-profile authors to, convert awareness to action against feminists, for this to be, feminists in academia to be met with every resistance that we can think of and enact, and so on. And it is then in this context that I came in with my invitations to take part in an interview study on the gender wars in feminism. So, findings. Those feminist academics who took part and who had expressed their views publicly, well, there's a long list of negative repercussions that they had personally experienced, spanning from being ostracized all the way to threats of violence, what Joe Phoenix called a continuum of hell. So if I'm going a bit too quickly, we can go back. Here I have two specific testimonies of personal experiences as a member of the audience. So Jeffrey spoke about the event at City, about witnessing how intimidating it was, witnessing an expression of male aggression, but also then, walking past people raising their fists, chanting, screaming, how that was frightening. Then Pedersen also talked to me about the time that she was a speaker at another 2019 event in Edinburgh, and how women were shaking on the stage. There had been bomb threats. there was a big protesters block outside, and women were being videoed as they were coming into the building. And then Julie Bindel was attacked, and Pedersen spoke about, you know, feeling absolutely terrified, then walking on her own to the train station after. Another concrete experience by another participant was that of setting up the GC Academic Network, and she spoke about getting many aggressive and very sexual messages, mass reporting as a hate site. Moving on to those feminist academics who had, let's say, chosen to remain silent, to not express their views. They all alluded to their career stage. So those in the earlier stages of their career would say that they didn't think they could survive the sort of backlash that they had seen colleagues in the discipline that were more senior face. Then a mid-career scholar spoke about not being a professor. She also mentioned that she felt like she didn't have her institution behind her, and she was afraid of the death and the rape threats. And then another participant in the late stage of her career spoke about wanting to, you know, end her career, you know, unscathed. And she spoke about being scared and this being so remaining quiet as being about self-preservation. All of the, let's call them silent feminists, spoke about feeling isolated and feeling torn about whether to speak out or not. They had experienced as well attempts to curtail their academic perspective. For instance, during the peer review process, being asked to change references of sex to gender. And now moving on to those participants who positioned themselves as in the middle, as agreeing with claims from both sides. And they would claim that that people in the middle don't have a space to speak, that there's no room for complexity and nuance, and that's the reason why they decide to stay out of the debate publicly. And so they spoke about having conversations with very few trusted colleagues. They spoke about a sort of strange secret club of feminists or secret conversations by gender scholars who don't feel like it is a safe space to speak. And they spoke about feeling depressed about these, by feeling afraid, of feeling alienated. Once I asked, what is it that you're scared about? You know, what are your fears? Then it became very clear that what at first sounded like a both side, you know, that the threat came from both sides, then it became clear that that wasn't the case. So they would speak about the violence that feminists have suffered, let's say online. They would speak about a particular sort of trans politics that has become so influential and which has cowed so many into submission. They spoke about being afraid of being branded as transphobic, of being classed as a gender critical feminist. And they very clearly, both implicitly and explicitly, as in the last quote, you know, how they saw it, it was very clear that the gender affirmative side had, at the time, the symbolic discursive hegemony, which produces material effects on people's careers, which involves gatekeeping that is enforced in extremely violent ways. And I'm, of course, quoting this mid-career sociologist. What do they want to talk about? Children and young people, with regards to the so-called affirmative approach. That was key. That came up again and again and again. But also other things, such as the need to collect sex data, such as the neoliberal or essentialist ideas that were perceived to be present in contemporary trans discourse. The fact that gender, according to this scholar, is ultimately about inequality and dominance. So very much mirroring the feminist perspective. They spoke about a set of self-preservation strategies. One of them was choosing silence. So, for instance, there was this scholar who's, admitted, yeah, there are things I could write, absolutely, but I'm too scared. I'm not going to do it. But also pulling back from gender studies altogether. So this scholar, for instance, spoke about the psychology about considering stopping gender and sexuality research altogether. Similarly, this other participant spoke about seriously contemplating stop teaching her gender-related course because she didn't feel safe. And this is a particularly emotional quote. She got quite upset because she was thinking about why she entered academia and how different the context was, where you cannot discuss and exchange ideas, and how she not just found it alienating but also very anxiety provoking because she didn't want to lose her job and because she didn't want to put her kids at risk, and she felt that if she spoke about this they would be put at risk. I also want to point out that another a GC a feminist or gender critical participant also spoke of stopping altogether her teaching on women's and gender studies. And again, a middle position participant stepped down partly because of this from her editorship. And she said that she didn't want to be associated with scholarship that was thought police. More self-preservation strategies by middle participants include acceding to the commands of the doctrine. So using the language that, as this participant said, we now have to add, and it happens without a debate. So talking about cis-normative, talking about cisgender, talking about men, women, and non-binary people. And this participant was also, even though she was very critical of the practice, she was also considering putting her pronouns at the end of her email simply to protect herself. And of course, these self-preservation strategies result in contributing to the culture of silencing. So, because of that fear of the violence, this late career scholar in sociology said, I wouldn't invite a GC speaker. Another scholar spoke about persuading her student to not conduct a very gender critical project, as she called it. Again, to kind of protect herself or to avoid the potential repercussions. Moving on to genderist academics. So when we would begin the conversations about silencing, the first reaction would be there is no silencing, to deny it, on the basis that, in their own words, feminists are endlessly on social media and on the mainstream media. And I have, as you can see, very many quotes that are basically, reflecting the same discourse. And on that basis, when we were discussing the decision by her organization to exclude what they call, trans-exclusive feminists, she said they have other spaces to occupy. Like many other genderists, she mentioned Phipps and Hines, and this other participant actually directly quoted Ahmed's influential blog, claiming that arguing that these claims about being silenced by feminists are actually a mechanism of power, while paradoxically, of course, admitting to be aiming to eliminate those positions. All talk is contradictory, of course, as we know, discourse analysts, but genderism is particularly contradictory. Then I would say, okay, then what about, academic context? When about, they're saying they're being silenced in academia, they're academics. And so they want to talk about the academic perspectives in academic spaces. And so now the narrative will shift and to get a different set of discourses. One of them had to do with academic merit. So this idea that feminism is of poor scholarly quality, that it has been delegitimized, that it's outdated, that it's out of touch. Another one has to do with the idea that feminism is violence. It's rhetorical, symbolic, or epistemic violence against people who identify as transgender. But actually, even more, that this rhetorical violence does have real-world aims, I was told. So it's real, so that it supports real-world violence. And so, for instance, when we were discussing the decision by her organization, association, to exclude feminists, or GC feminists, these other participants said, you know, it's different to say we are silencing somebody versus we're actually causing harm, which is what feminism is taken to do. Lots of comparisons when it came to defending no platforming of feminists, comparisons with white supremacists, with those on the far right, with those with homophobic or misogynistic views. And then when it came to the treatment of feminists, speaking in particular about the city event, a participant with a role at an organization involved in the event justified the treatment through a discourse of legitimate response. So she said, you know, okay, in terms that they were shamed and booed and disrespected, well, you know, you need to be accountable for the things that you say, and if they're harmful, then particularly if you're going to pursue the argument that this is all about free speech, then it is okay for people to absolutely respond to that offence that's been caused, according to this participant. More generally speaking about, you know, the violence, well, generally in terms of the violence against feminists by sectors of transgender rights activists and allies, I also found a discourse of retaliation, and including of legitimate retaliation, as very clearly by this PhD student who said, I can understand the backlash, I can understand the want to retaliate, and she was very aware of the field. There's also a discourse of equivalent violence, so this idea that, you know, you cannot say that one form of violence, let's say the physical violence, is worse than the epistemic violence. At most, you know, in a private conversation, I was once told that they're differently textured violences, but both as bad. There's also the discourse of unequal power, the idea that women, cis women, are more hold more power than trans people. And again, my participants were very aware of the field. This very strong condemnation, and I found this particularly intriguing, comes with striking ignorance about feminism. So when I would ask participants to, you know, define for me what the main issues were, what the arguments by feminists were, they struggled, and they would even tell me, I don't know, even though they were otherwise very active. So, for instance, this scholar was very, very, you know, engaged, but she justified this in terms of, I'm focused on protecting students, I'm focused on supporting my friends who are trans, not on engaging with the argument. And in the same way, by and large, genderist participants were unfamiliar with GC feminist texts, or even the name of authors, including those teaching or researching around this topic. So there was a very clear no reading policy, and this was explained in terms by one leading genderist author in terms of, you know, being focused on putting out understandings of gender as opposed to debating with those that had different ideas. A participant with a role as an organization spoke about not wanting to pay for gender critical work, because otherwise she would be contributing to the problem as she saw it, but also the fact, you know, this discourse of not having enough time and there being much better literature out there.
Sorry, Laura, that's 35 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Genderism and echo chambers. Again, I have very many quotes where they tell me, you know, that they are in echo chambers on these, and that their experience is of speaking with people with different views is very limited. And for that reason, a number of them actually said that they appreciated the space that the interview produced, that they appreciated having had the space to reflect, to have a critical line of questioning, to have honest conversations. And so, for instance, this participant hoped that there were more spaces like that just for trans-inclusive feminists, though. Walters, for example, as well, towards the end, realized, you know, she said, it's been wonderful to talk to you. And actually, on the basis of our conversation, then she says, yeah, it is also, she said, it's also, I've realized it's also a US phenomenon, not just UK, but the way that it has manifested is precisely, you know, the avoidance of these conversations. Genderist participants tended to struggle discussing the concepts of sex and gender, as well as the practical issues involved in the dispute. And this was not just obvious to me, observing it, but also they would tell me. This was explained particularly in these two ways. So first of all, that they were afraid of causing harm with their speech to transgender people, that there was a lack of clarity of thought, even though, you know, note that this is the area of expertise that we were discussing. And another journal editor spoke about her theoretical perspective. So she said to me that as a post-structuralist, she doesn't understand any of the words that she uses per se, so she couldn't define gender for me. So it becomes quite clear from the data that genderism is primarily a political, not an intellectual position. And, you know, we can see it here in the quotes where, you know, intellectualizing is seen as harmful. This talk about being on the right side, towing the party line, being there for your team, but also their sense of intuitively of feeling that they're on the right side, but they can't defend it, they can't justify it. And this what they would tell me, other people must know. I'm sure others know. This was more about their commitment to inclusiveness, so very, very much a political thing rather than an intellectual exercise. And finally, I did want to note that even though this is a relative exception, a few participants, genderist participants, spoke about negative consequences as a result of the work and their academic views, their views. And so one participant spoke about getting very much and constant abuse, people trying to get her fired, being called sort of names, receiving threats, even though she did say that it wasn't feminists who were threatening her, and what she perceived as problematic behavior by feminists had to do with what she saw as an inaccurate and unfair characterization of her work. And two participants who did speak about getting backlash from their research projects. And obviously that is important, but as a generally speaking, my qualitative findings, it is very clear that there's an evident pattern contrast in the prevalence and in severity of repercussions, as well as their own position on no debate. And my data also indicates that no debate the no debate tactic in genderism has transformed from an activist tactic into an academic culture that also has negative effects on genderists and their allies. Again, the qualitative findings suggest that it is feminist women in particular who are the object of persecution. The findings complicate the generational rift narrative. And generally speaking, I see it as a case study of neoliberal academia. And here, if you want to, we can later look at some quotes from the data. I'm also thinking about activist academia, populist academia. I have a great quote by Joe Phoenix on that, but also patriarchal academia. And in that sense, in order to locate the findings, I'm thinking about, you know, the neoliberalization and remasculinization of the university, which includes the shift from women's studies to gender studies. I'm going to go fast now because I'm thinking about broader structural transformations that have been well researched, you know, the precariousness, the unsustainable workloads, the ever-growing pressure and competition, and how that has detrimental effects on the health and welfare of academics, how that has resulted in a decline of solidarity, how that fosters unethical behaviors that include bullying, and of course, you know, I'm not forgetting, you know, that the gender wars take place in an institutional context where female academics in particular have to contend with manifold layers of discrimination. They have to navigate institutionalized sexism and masculinist work models. And thinking conjuncturally, if I, you know, as they say in cultural studies, about the gender wars, I'm thinking, you know, about neoliberalism. Genderism is, of course, very much in alignment. I'm thinking about the different elements of the social media cultures. I'm thinking about what some scholars call post-factual politics, again, which I see as being very much in alignment with genderism. What some feminists call an anti-feminist backlash, a new misogyny, a new patriarchy, and being as it is a site of struggle, here is where we see a new wave or a resurgent wave of feminism, you know, challenging this emphasis on feelings as opposed to facts, challenging the medical industrial complex, fighting for the sex-based rights of women, as well as the rise of other counter movements. And I think I'm going to stop there. As I say, I have quotes, analytic quotes from the data, but I think it's time, isn't it, Laura?
Thank you so much, Laura. That was, yeah, that was fantastic. So I think that we have a Q&A chat, which hopefully people should be able to put questions in. If that doesn't work, I will try and reopen the chat instead, or just put your hand up and ask a question. Do note that we are recording this, so if you don't want your sort of face and voice to be recorded, then just put something in the Q&A instead. But
Laura, I think the chat's disabled, so probably should
yeah,
hands up.
I'll just, yeah. So I said there is a Q&A function which you should be able to put a question in. Is that not working?
Let me see.
Shall I keep sharing or shall I, in case we want to go back to the slides, or shall I get the?
I think just it's good to see you at the moment.
Yes, you can do Q&A. Yeah.
Yes.
I'll stop sharing then.
So anybody got a question for Laura? We've got about 15 minutes before the end of the session. Joe.
How many years has it been since we've been on Teams, and yet I still always forget to unmic myself or unmute myself. Laura, are you prepared to share some of those slides?
Oh, share in what sense?
As in, will you make them available to us?
Well, I especially want to make them available in terms of publications.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, we can talk about this. Yeah, let's talk about.
There's some really interesting stuff in there, and in particular some of the references that you've put in that, you know, I'm unaware of. I'd really like to read some of the work, you know, and even from people from, if you like, the other side of the fence, in an effort to try and understand from their point of view what's going on. You know, I was quite struck in the quotes from the genderist side. You know, it wasn't what I anticipated.
No?
I anticipated a lot more talk about harm and safety and stuff like that. Whereas, you know, there was other stuff going on, the thread about accountability in particular. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that thread around accountability, please.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it derives from that idea that feminism is harm, and that and so I mean, as I see it, I have to say, I see it as a sort of victim blaming discourse.
Okay.
Right? It's almost you made me do it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But that's my reading. Perhaps it's a bit too critical. Perhaps there's another potential reading. But I mean, we were discussing that in the context of the way that Long and Jeffries were treated.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So that was fairly specific to what was quite overtly aggressive treatment of two individuals.
Yeah, and then there's of course the discourse of retaliation, of legitimate retaliation, and it's more the same thing, and that derives from that idea that it's feminism is violent. So if you've been attacked, you attack back.
Thank you. So we have a question in the Q&A saying, out of your participants, do you know the white versus non-white racial background? So what was the ethnicity of the participants?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't got the slide because, of course, I do know. Yes, I'm sorry, I haven't got the slide here, but I have to say that I did make an effort, because I did, when I mentioned about the things that I was thinking about when it came to recruitment, one of them was to have as many scholars from ethnic minorities as possible. Also because, you know, the notion of intersectionality, which I haven't explored today at all, what is key as well to this dispute, debate, with both sides, if I may, claiming to be conducting an intersectional analysis. So I was keen to hear from scholars that were experts in intersectional studies or analysis, but also, you know, from different ethnic backgrounds. So yeah, there's the majority. So the majority was white, but and that I will be analysing that in the future. I can talk about that.
Thank you. So we have another question in the Q&A saying, I imagine that gender critical is quite a broad church. So did you ask GC participants what they understood by gender critical, the term, and how they position themselves within it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, the interviews covered, you know, the conceptual elements, terminologies, and then the more practical elements. And of course, as part of that, where even the term gender wars, I discussed the term with, you know, with my participants across, you know, and in terms of gender critical, there was a tendency to reject the term, but also to understand why it appeared. Right, and with participants, you know, they would explain that to me, and also the idea of gender critical as referring to it was Jane Clare Jones that said she wanted to be on the record. I said, you know, it's a very basic. Sex is you know, biological reality that cannot be changed, then gender being roles and stereotypes and so on. And so, yeah. But in general terms, that's not they wouldn't choose to define themselves that way.
Thank you. So were people more defining themselves as feminist?
Yeah. I like, that was your quote, Joe. What was it? The good old-fashioned feminist college. So that, or Sheila Jeffries, you know, saying actual feminism, because, you know, it is very basic, you know.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Anybody want to put their hand up? So I do. Don't.
Yeah, sorry, just one last one. Where do you see all of this going? Not in terms of your publication, you know, where you're going with the research, but just this moment that you have documented in time in universities that themselves are in a particular moment of time. If you were to fast forward to 5 to 10 years, where do you see all of this going?
It's fascinating to be asked that very question that I have asked so many times myself, my participants. I mean, obviously, as they say, you know, tides are changing. You know, the climate has changed very much. Even the fact that I'm giving this talk, I think reflects the fact that things are changing. That this the grasp that the genderist narratives had. You know, this idea that anybody who critiques this or challenges this or wants to ask questions is, you know, a bigot, an extreme right. That's been slowly, you know, thanks to the efforts of so many, especially feminists, you know, that things have been changing, along with other narratives that were so dominant, and slowly, you know, there have been the counter narratives with regards to this is, you know, the old dinosaurs versus the, you know, the enlightened youth. So how do I say? I don't know, but perhaps hope. I hope that in 5 years' time we will be back to normal, back to, you know, to the expected, you know, doing our work as sociologists, asking questions, having debates, agreeing to disagree.
And we have another question as well. Thank you, Laura, for sharing this fascinating data and your really lucid analysis. This is for a PhD student looking at policy actors, how policy actors have framed the debate in Scotland and the UK. And something I've been trying to think about is the middle position. So in your view, would you say you struggled to find a distinctly identified middle, and rather found those who called themselves middle were actually voicing common gender critical positions?
Well, yeah, I mean that's the thing. Perhaps not so much. Yeah, I mean their concerns reflected the feminist position, but they didn't necessarily agree. So for instance, they would tell me, you know, one of them said, no, I don't want, you know, she was afraid of being classed as a gender critical feminist, and she said, I don't think I am, because I don't think that sex is binary, or I don't think that sex is fixed, you know. So, but their concerns, both in terms of the practical issues, so single sex spaces, contradictorily, but they were worried about single sex spaces, and, you know, and then the manifestations of the debate, the critique of the manifestations, so the violence, the silence, was in alignment with the feminist position. But in terms of conceptually, did I find a middle position? Not really. I mean, and I can show you how they find it themselves. I have a quote by a middle participant defining what middle means. And basically, it's, where is it? Oh, this is the fear of sounding turfy. Let me just show you. Share. No. Let's see if you can see it. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Well, basically, I mean, oh, here it is.
Yes.
Yeah, basically, I'm faced with a situation, and I know I'm not the only one, where I weirdly agree with many of the claims on the trans side, the gender affirmative side, agree with many of the claims on the gender critical side, and I think we need both to develop a complex analysis of all this. But they didn't put forward themselves an alternative, let's say, position to the ones that I have mapped, outlined today. If that answers the question. Yeah?
So it's more that they didn't want to kind of align with either side, rather than I have a distinct
they didn't have
view myself.
An alternative, let's say an alternative position or alternative. No, it was I agree with bits, some here, some there. Yeah. So to answer the question, yes, no, the middle position didn't offer. They didn't offer a distinct, they didn't articulate a distinct perspective.
Yes, thank you. Okay, do we have any last questions? Something strange has happened with your sharing screen, Laura.
Okay.
But, yeah. I think if not, then we can say, well, actually, I did have one question for you, which I was very struck by your the quote that you said about differently textured violence. That really, because we're talking about the difference between punching somebody in the face or attacking people physically, or kind of saying something that you disagree with. I just wondered, where do you think that's come from? Like in terms of how has that idea taken hold, do you think?
Well, obviously genderism is very, 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 it's a child of post-structuralist thinking and then queer theory. So I see it as following from the extreme relativity, and that focus on discourse and that detachment from the material, where that is what allows for someone to come to that conclusion.
Yes.
That a punch is as harmful as
it's the same.
I don't agree with your definition of your understanding of yourself.
Yeah. No, I think you're probably right. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming to talk to us. It's absolutely fascinating, and really look forward to writing it up and seeing it in publication. It's such comprehensive approach that you've taken. It's really fantastic. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you for the invitation, and for everyone for joining me.
Yeah, well, this is what we set this up for. So, counter a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. So we have 2 seminars coming up. The next one is on the 25th of April at 1 p.m. And we will have Philip Stoko, who can talk to us, who's a psychoanalyst who used to work formerly from the Tavistock. We'll be talking about psychoanalytic approaches to gender identity.